the baby, the beast, and a woman's forgiveness. There was no moon that night. The wind howled through the arid valley, whistling between the rocks like the whispers of restless souls long denied salvation. In a remote corner of the village, where even oil lamps feared to shine, stood a dilapidated hut made of decaying straw and scrap wood. Inside, an old woman trembled, leaning on a crooked bamboo cane. Her voice, hoarse but unmistakable, rose with prayerful recitations, each word heavy with something deeper than ritual, unwavering faith, born from a soul crushed but never extinguished. Her name was Ruqayyah, a name no one in the village dared speak aloud anymore. Here, she was called many things: the witch, the heretic, the bitter old hag. But no one ever asked why a frail, illiterate widow had become a thorn in the side of an entire community. No one remembered, perhaps no one cared, that she was once the most beautiful girl in the valley, once loved a man with all her heart, and once nearly stoned to death by her own people for believing in a god with no image, no statue, and no name. It all began on a scorched summer day years ago, when a wandering ascetic passed through the village. He sat under a mango tree near the well and began reciting a scripture no one had ever heard before. It had no wild myths, no promises of glory, no threats of damnation. It had only one truth: God resides in every act of goodness. Ruqayyah, widowed, abandoned, sleeping beside stray dogs, sat beside the man and asked, "Who are you speaking of?" "Here, we only know stone idols that give if we offer enough." The man smiled gently and replied, "If you place your hand over your heart and ask yourself, who keeps this heart beating, that is God." That sentence, so simple, so pure, moved her to tears. From that day forward, Ruqayyah ceased to be a villager. She became a person of faith. And as with all who awaken to something higher, the price was steep: exile and silent persecution. One day, as she fumbled along a hillside to avoid being beaten again, she came upon a large creature groaning in the shadows of a rock, a wounded leopard. But instead of recoiling in fear, Ruqayyah approached. Her hands trembled as she placed one upon the beast's forehead and whispered, "If you wish to kill me, so be it. But if you are in pain, let me be the hands of God to heal you." It wasn't doctrine. It was the instinct of a soul that had known so much suffering, it could recognize another's. She tore her scarf to bandage its wounds, offered rainwater caught in leaves, and when she stood to leave, she expected nothing. But it followed her. From that moment on, two abandoned beings, one woman, one beast, lived side by side. They dwelled like shadows, nameless, voiceless, in a desolate hut. Yet every night as Ruqayyah prayed, the leopard lay still, eyes closed, ears perked as if listening to something deeper than language. In Buddhist teachings, there is a concept: silent awareness, when the heart touches the sacred without needing words. Perhaps this leopard, with its wild heart but unextinguished gratitude, understood those prayers better than any self-proclaimed believer in nearby villages. That morning, the forest mists still clung to the air when Ruqayyah awoke from a hazy dream, her late husband smiling, reaching out to her hand, a white light blurring everything behind him. The leopard lay curled at her feet, its wounded leg tucked gently beneath, as if not to disturb her. She stroked its head and murmured, "Still haven't left this old woman behind, have you?" It didn't growl. Instead, it pressed its head against her lap like a child seeking affection, then slowly sat up. Its leg had not fully healed, but the bleeding had stopped. Looking around, twisting roots, jagged rocks, the forest floor like a tangled net, she noticed something through the mist: an abandoned bamboo shack, aged and forgotten. She approached with the leopard. The door, just a torn woven mat, swung loosely. Inside, dust, but also life. A blackened pot, a tattered mat, a few jars of rainwater, even an oil lamp lying in the corner. No footprints, no recent presence. It was as if the place had been waiting for her. She whispered, "Well then, if this is heaven's will." She let out a breath, unwrapped her headscarf, and began wiping the dust from the floor. She laid the leopard down to rest. That day, the abandoned shack became a home. Days passed. She lived as if never cast out. Gathering dry twigs, catching water from banana leaves, boiling thin rice porridge from grains gifted by far-off hamlets. The leopard no longer wildly still during prayers, watching her with eyes that weren't submissive, but almost reverent. On stormy nights, when wind screamed through the torn roof, it curled up beside her. It never left. Not once. Even when she said, "You're a creature of the wild. You don't belong to people." It stayed. One afternoon, laughter echoed from afar. Ruqayyah stepped out, hiding behind a tree. At the foot of the hill lay a bustling village, red-roofed homes, smoke rising from kitchen fires. Children raced through fields, women carried water from the stone well, men lounged with tobacco pipes under sunlit porches. A world, so alive, so unlike hers. She turned back, whispered to the leopard, "They have families. I have you." It lowered its head, nudging her gently. What she didn't know was that someone in that village had seen her. And the leopard. A week later, a group of village men climbed the hill. They carried machetes, bamboo staffs, and curious boys tagging along. As they approached, they heard murmuring prayers. A woman's voice, old, raspy, but unwavering. They stood outside the shack, silent in the fading golden light. Inside, the old woman sat cross-legged, eyes closed, lips reciting steadily. Beside her, the leopard lay like a statue. No one dared approach. One man whispered, "It's her, that heretic crone. Banished from the next village. But why hasn't the beast killed her?" Another replied, "Possessed, perhaps. Maybe she's a witch." They returned home with the village's strangest tale yet. An old woman and a leopard, living in the woods. Both pray. The next day, a group of women arrived, some with authority in the village. They didn't knock. From afar, they shouted, "Hey, old witch! What are you doing in there? We called, you didn't answer." Ruqayyah finished her prayer, opened her eyes, stood calmly, and pulled her scarf over her head. "I was praying," she said. "This is a sacred hour." A young woman with dagger-sharp eyes stepped forward. "Praying? To who? There's only stone here. Nothing else." The old woman met her gaze without fear. "I pray to the one who sees although he has no form." "Oh really?" the woman sneered. "Let's see if your one can save you from what's coming." At that moment, the leopard stood. It did not growl. It simply stared into the woman's eyes. The crowd stepped back, instinctively. A chill rippled through their spines. The old woman placed a hand on the leopard's head. "Don't. They just don't understand yet. But they will." What she didn't know was that these women would not let it go. They would carry today's shame back to the village, nurture it with hatred, envy, and pride until it became a storm. A storm that would begin with a mother's soul-shattering scream. That morning, there was no rain. No wind. Only golden sunlight poured across the village courtyard like honey gilding the earth. The sound of drums echoed from the village center. It was the celebration of the firstborn son of the region's most powerful family. The child's mother was a young, proud woman who once sneered at Rukaya when the old woman dragged buckets of water from the foothills. "You still think you're sacred, old hag," she once spat at Rukaya's feet. "If you were truly holy, why don't you have a decent roof over your head? Why don't you have a child to burn incense for your grave?" Rukaya said nothing then. She only lowered her head and kept walking uphill with the water, only to collapse that night onto cold earth, gasping, while laughter from the village echoed above her like cruel music. And now, this was the day they invited the entire village to feast. Banners waved down the streets, incense smoke curled into the sky, and trays of sweets were laid out like offerings to pride. People stuffed each other's mouths with flattery and fake laughter, while the drums pounded like hammers on Rukaya's heart, not from envy, but from a deep, gnawing unease. The leopard had risen early that day. It didn't eat. It didn't drink. It paced restlessly in front of the hut, claws digging into the soil. Rukaya watched and quietly asked, "What is it, child? Is there something in the wind I can't hear?" It didn't answer, of course not, but its eyes never left the dirt path that led down into the village. If you're still watching this video and feel connected to Rukaya's story, please comment 3 below to let me know you're here. And if you haven't yet subscribed, I encourage you to do so and hit the bell. Your support helps us keep creating meaningful content to inform and inspire. A scream. First a cry, then a wail so sharp it pierced the sky. A woman, hair wild, feet bare, came tearing through the woods, clawing the dirt, screaming, "My child! Help me! Someone help me!" The drums stopped. A stillness like death spread across the village. A man stumbled behind her, falling face first into the dirt, his hands shaking violently. It was the leopard. A huge one. Came out of the woods. It took the child, bit him, and vanished into the mist. No one could understand what was happening. The young mother collapsed at the edge of the courtyard, clutching her chest, repeating over and over, "My baby, my baby, my baby." The village erupted into chaos. The strongest men grabbed swords and staffs, charging into the forest. Children screamed, only to be dragged away with hands muffling their mouths. Back on the mountain slope, Rukaya stood. The leopard was gone. Her heart slammed in her chest. She refused to think the worst. She dropped to her knees, bowed deeply, and whispered, "If what I fear has happened, let me be the one to make it right." She rose, grabbed her cane, and began descending the mountain. By the time she reached the village, it was frozen in silence. The young mother lay on the ground, surrounded by a crowd. Some men had returned, scratched, breathless, heads shaking. "We didn't see it. It vanished into the forest. It probably ate the child." The mother let out a scream, a raw, broken sound as if her soul had been ripped in half. She flailed, reaching through the air for something that wasn't there. And then Rukaya stepped forward. Silently. Her eyes met the young mother's, not with blame, not with anger. Only one thing: compassion. "I can help," she said. The crowd exploded in cruel laughter. "You? What can you do? The child's already been eaten. What are you going to do? Pray it out of the leopard's belly." Another voice yelled. "You raised the beast. Did you teach it to bite people too? You brought this curse on us." The young mother, drained, lifted tear-hollowed eyes to Rukaya. If you can, if my child is still alive, I will kneel before the God you believe in." Silence. Not a single breath stirred the air. Rukadia stepped forward and placed a hand on the mother's shoulder. If the child lives, I will bring him back. But I must pray first. She turned, unrolled her scarf, and bowed beneath the ancient tree in the village center. No one stopped her. No one dared. Because even in their disbelief, they clung to something small, a sliver of hope. When her prayer ended, she rose, took her cane, and began walking toward the forest. But as her figure began to disappear, a voice rang out. I'm going with you. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward, one of the very people who had once demanded she be thrown out of the village. He sneered. I want to see what this old witch can actually do. And when she fails, I'll bury her beneath that tree myself. Rukadia didn't flinch. She looked straight into his eyes, as if staring through to the marrow of his soul. Then come. But don't interfere. And together, they disappeared into the trees, where even the leaves didn't dare rustle too loudly because something enormous was about to unfold. Night fell like ink. In the forest, every insect cry was a war drum. Every footstep on decaying leaves felt like a countdown toward doom. The man behind Rukadia still wore a crooked smile, eyes sharp like blades. Rukadia, hunched and frail, held her trembling cane, but every step was firm, as though she walked not with legs, but with the fire of a soul forged in sorrow. What are you planning to do? The man asked, half mocking, half curious. I'm not planning, Rukadia replied softly. I'm asking. Asking the leopard to spare the child? And you think it'll listen? If a living being knows gratitude, it knows mercy. He laughed loud, bitter, then suddenly froze. A growl. Close. To their left. Shit, he hissed, gripping his staff. His eyes darted. But Rukadia didn't move. She stood still, unafraid. She didn't look around. She didn't run. She closed her eyes. Child, if you still hold the baby, please, come forth. No reply. Just the faint rustling of underbrush. Then, a large shadow leapt out. The leopard. Its fur shimmered under the faint moonlight. Its eyes blazed like twin amber stones. And in its jaws, gently curled, perfectly intact, was the sleeping child. The man dropped his staff, stunned. And Rukadia, her eyes filled with tears. You listened to me, you didn't do what I feared most. She dropped to her knees. Come. Give me the child. But the leopard didn't move. It stared at her, its gaze fierce, painful. There was something stormy in its eyes, as though it carried a tempest bottled for too long. The man backed away. You're insane. It'll kill you next. Rukadia said nothing. She stepped forward. Each step a whispered plea. If you remember my hands cleaning your blood. If you remember that stormy night I held you like my own. Then please, don't let this end with a child's blood. The leopard growled but didn't lunge. It sat down. With a gentle motion so unnatural it chilled the air, it set the child down. It licked the baby's forehead like a mother's farewell. Then stepped back. Rukadia knelt, lifted the child. He was still breathing. Still warm. She held him to her chest, whispering through tears. Thank you, my child. But when she turned, the man was gone. On the road back, Rukadia carried the sleeping child in her arms. Her gaze far away. She knew even if she returned the child safely to the village, the story wouldn't end here. Because some people, they will never believe what they cannot understand. And they will always hate what threatens the foundation of their faith. Under the moonlight, the leopard stood motionless on a high stone ledge, watching the small figure disappear at the base of the hill. Its eyes, no longer those of a beast, reflected something else, the gaze of a child who finally understood. It belonged neither to the world of humans, nor to the wild. When Rukheya returned, the sky was still dark, but the entire village was lit. People packed the courtyard. Torches flared, incense smoke swirled, and eyes brimmed with tension, half hope, half dread, as if awaiting either a miracle or a funeral. Whispers buzzed like insects. Some swore she had been devoured. Others claimed to have heard a crying child in the woods, the sound of a ghost not yet laid to rest. Rumors tangled like old roots around the hearts of the villagers. And then, that silhouette appeared, hunched, hair silver like frost, arms cradling a child still alive, sleeping peacefully as if no monster had ever taken him away. A stunned silence cracked the village wide open. The young mother nearly collapsed forward, falling to her knees, ripping the child from Rukheya's arms, wailing with unbearable joy. "My baby! Oh God, my baby is alive! He's really alive!" The child whimpered in her arms, then opened his eyes, black and bright, like the water in the old village well. She looked up into Rukheya's eyes for the first time with neither pride nor scorn. Only trembling. And gratitude. You saved him." Rukheya nodded gently. Her voice was hoarse. "I didn't save him. Only a creature who remembers kindness would do such a thing." The girl clutched her baby tighter, tears pouring down. The villagers looked at each other, eyes flickering, confused, uncertain whether to feel joy or fear, something too great for their faith to contain. A man stepped forward, the same man who had followed Rukheya into the forest. He stood still, jaw clenched, fists trembling. He said nothing. But everyone knew he had seen everything. He couldn't deny it. And that terrified him more than anything else. That night, the village did not sleep. Not because of celebration. But because, for the first time, they felt small before something they could not control. A child was taken by a leopard and lived. A forsaken woman was protected. A wounded beast had shown mercy. Everything they once believed, everything they used to mock, curse, and beat Rukheya for, was unraveling within them. By dawn, before the sun crested the ridgeline, Rukheya was already awake. She washed her face with cold water, kindled a fire, and heated a pot of tea. The little hut was quieter than usual because today, the leopard no longer lay beside the ashes. She blew gently over the teacup, poured the steaming liquid into a small bowl, and placed it on a wooden plank as if offering it to an invisible guest. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply listened to the wind in the trees, each rustle like a whisper returning from the deep woods. From below, someone was climbing the hill. Not with clubs, but with a white scarf in trembling hands. The young mother, her child still asleep, stood outside the hut, hands shaking as she held out the cloth. "This is a scarf worn only by those we honor. I have nothing else to offer. Please accept it." Rukheya did not reach for it. She only asked, "Do you believe in what you cannot see?" The woman lowered her head. "I'm not sure, but I know what I believed before couldn't save my child." "You did." A soft breeze passed, carrying the scent of damp forest, and the footsteps of others, villagers beginning to climb the hill. They didn't come to chase her away. They came to listen. If you're still watching this video and feel moved by what Rukheya has done, please comment 6 below to let me know you're here. If you haven't subscribed yet, I encourage you to click subscribe and tap the bell. Your support helps us continue creating meaningful content to inform and inspire. They didn't speak when they entered the hut. The man who once called her a witch stood in the back. The women who made her carry water bowed their heads. Even the children who once scattered thorns in her path clung to their mother's skirts, unable to meet her eyes. Rukayya sat quietly. The white scarf had been placed upon her head, glowing like a gentle silver moon. She scolded no one, blamed no one. She simply poured more water into the kettle and filled extra cups. "Tea is bitter," she said, offering each one, "but if you let it cool, you'll find it sweet. Just like the heart, it must go through regret to know the taste of humility." No one dared lift their cup. The village chief's wife, the one who had once snatched Rukayya's cane, spit in her rice. Couldn't speak. She knelt, hands clasped together. We don't understand. We don't understand why the leopard didn't kill. Why it came back." Rukayya smiled, her eyes soft and strange, like moonlight through fog. "Because it learned love. Because it remembered kindness." A man interjected, voice sharp, not in anger, but desperation. "Did you train it? Or was it sorcery?" His question dropped like a stone. The air grew thick. But the old woman didn't scowl. She simply paused, then answered. "If I could train a leopard, then I could train the human heart. But sadly, I don't have magic strong enough for that." And with those words, every eye dropped to the floor. No one could raise their head. A small child whispered to his mother, "Mom, is she a fairy?" The mother shook her head, tears falling. "No. She's only human." By noon, the village gathered beneath the mountain tree, not to plan a stone idol ritual for once, but to listen. Rukayya spoke of the days she was cast out. Of her first night sleeping among rotting leaves, dogs howling into the third watch of the night. Of the first time she met the leopard, its blood painting the earth, and how she nearly ran, but its eyes made her stay. "I knew I would never have children," she said. "But perhaps Allah gave me a child in the form of a leopard." Then she turned to the young mother. "And your child, he was raised by the leopard for one night, so that he may one day know, life is not just flesh and blood, but mercy." The crowd said nothing. No one knew what to say. Until a whisper broke the silence, soft, shaking. From the same man who had once threatened to kill her. "If you hadn't saved the boy, I would have died with guilt." Rukayya turned to him, looked deep into his eyes, and said, "No one carries guilt, if they can still recognize it. Only those who refuse to see themselves are more dangerous than beasts." The man broke down sobbing. He bowed to the earth like a child. One person. Then two. Then all. One by one, they knelt. No one told them to. But they all understood something had shattered inside them. The masks sculpted from pride, superstition, and self-righteousness disguised as faith were falling away. And beneath them, the raw faces emerged. Faces of fear, of confusion, and a desperate longing to be forgiven. And then, a voice rose, not Rukayya's but from the woman who had once mocked her the most. "Teach us how you have lived." That afternoon, the air was still, yet the forest stirred. As if something was retreating, a shadowy presence long clinging to kitchen corners, hunched backs, and whispered tales, now exhaling its final breath and slipping away from the village. Beneath the old banyan tree, the villagers gathered like students before a teacher. There were no drums, no books, no rituals. Only the quiet, steady voice of an old woman, deep, real, and strangely comforting. Someone asked, "Why aren't you angry with us?" Ruqayyah's eyes drifted far away, as if speaking to her own shadow. "I used to be so angry, I wanted to run so far I'd never see another face again. But every time I felt that rage, I remembered the night the leopard whimpered in pain. It wasn't human. But it still knew suffering. So how could humans not know compassion?" Another asked, "Then what is your faith?" She smiled gently. "To rise each morning, without hatred in my heart, not even for myself." They didn't fully understand. But they nodded. Not because they got it, but because they wanted to. And for a beginning, that was enough. But in the village's farthest corner, where the light did not reach, one man refused to bow his head. The old shrine priest, the keeper of the stone idol for decades, sat alone before the cracked statue. The setting sun filtered through the ruined wall, casting his face in a dull yellow-gray. Since the child had been returned, since the villagers had climbed the mountain to listen to the old woman, he had not spoken a word. He didn't cry. He wasn't angry. He was simply silent. But it was the silence of a copper pot about to boil over. That night, while the village slept and the wind whispered through the dry leaves, he quietly left the shrine. In his hand a knife. On the mountain, Ruqayyah's hut still glowed with lamplight. She was lighting incense, placing a bowl of porridge on a small table, not for herself, but for the child who left, the leopard. She hadn't seen it since the night the child was returned. But she believed it was still watching. "If you can hear me, know that I'm not angry. Just missing you," the wind whispered. And then she heard a sound. Not the paw steps of a beast, but the footfalls of a man. An old figure stepped inside, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights, lips trembling, hands clutching the knife. "You've made the whole village change," he said, voice trembling. "But I don't want to change." Ruqayyah didn't flinch. She stood and looked him in the eye. "No," she said, "you're afraid. Afraid that if you let go of your stone god, you'll have nothing left to hold onto." "I'm not afraid," he snapped. "I'm angry. I worshipped this silent rock my entire life. I knelt before it to beg for rain, for grain, for mercy. And now, a leopard teaches people gratitude. An old woman teaches the village to pray. And what am I? Forgotten." His voice cracked. The knife lifted. But in that very instant a shadow flew forward. The leopard. Its roar tore through the hut like thunder. The knife clattered to the floor, spinning once before stopping. The old man collapsed, eyes wide in terror. Teeth gleaming and deadly hovered just inches from his face. One more step, and he'd never rise again. But the leopard did not bite. It stood between him and Ruqayyah, breathing hard, growling low, as if to say, "That's enough." Ruqayyah placed a gentle hand on the leopard's head. "You don't have to kill, to prove anything." The leopard stepped back, eyes still fixed on the priest. Ruqayyah picked up the knife and offered it to the old man. "If you still wish to kill me, do it. But if not, go home. And ask yourself, who truly needs saving?" He said nothing. He stood and walked into the night. The knife remained exactly where she left it. The next morning, it rained. Not a heavy rain. Just a thin veil, soft as breath. Enough to cleanse the village soil and leave it smelling clean. People woke and stepped outside, gazing at the sky. Not quite sure why their hearts suddenly felt lighter. No one saw the priest leave the shrine. But they didn't hear him shout as he once did, either. Only the sound of a bamboo broom scraping wet leaves. And the shape of a thin old man quietly sweeping the temple yard. Up on the mountain, the hut was quieter than usual. Rukhedia sat beside the fire, eyes sunken deep, her breath slow. The leopard had returned that night. But it no longer slept by the door. It slept curled beside her, its head resting on a pillow, like a child in its mother's arms. No one called it a beast anymore. In the villagers' hearts, it now had a name, the Protector. And the child who was returned once a newborn who survived the jaws of the wild was now 1 month old. On the day of his ceremony, the whole village gathered in the courtyard. There were no lavish trays of food like festivals past. No pounding drums. No praise for stone idols. Just a small table. A jar of clean water. And a white scarf draped across the child's chest. He lay in his mother's arms, eyes wide, staring at the sky. Then a little girl, the daughter of one who once threw stones at Rukhedia, stepped forward. "Miss, can the baby talk yet?" she asked. Rukhedia leaned down and smiled. "Not yet, child. But he knows how to listen." The girl tilted her head. "Then, will he hear me if I talk to him? If you speak from your heart, anyone will hear you." The girl leaned close to the baby's ear and whispered, "Thank you for coming back. And thank you for not being angry at anyone." The baby's mother burst into tears. Not from pain, but because, for the first time in her life, her heart felt clean like a village well after rain. Rukhedia stood, lifting the child in her arms, and looked out across the village. This child was once held in the jaws of a beast. And yet, he was not harmed. Because that beast had once been tended to by a stranger who wrapped its wounds. She raised her eyes to the sky, her voice clear like a temple bell. When someone is shown compassion, they learn to forgive. When someone is saved, they learn to save others. And when someone is cast out but never casts out kindness, that is how a village is reborn. No one spoke. No one needed to. The baby burst into laughter, flailing his hands in the air, as if reaching for something unseen hovering above them all. Change. The leopard didn't come that day. It lay deep in the forest, beside a cold stone by the stream. But every laugh, every cry from the child drifting down from the village, its ears twitched ever so slightly. It didn't need to be seen. Because it knew. It had done enough. And then, something no one expected happened. The shrine priest appeared. He walked slowly, empty-handed, his face no longer clouded. He came to the old woman, and for the first time in his life bowed deeply. "I worshipped stone my entire life," he said. But stone never spoke. Yesterday, I closed my eyes, and reached for something without form. And for the first time, I didn't feel empty. He looked up. Eyes once dry and hardened were now shimmering like rain at the start of spring. "If you'll allow me, please teach me. Not scripture. Just, teach me how to forgive myself." Rukhedia placed a hand on his shoulder. "I don't teach anyone. But if you're willing to listen, then every drop of water, every branch of every tree, will teach you." The ceremony ended in silence. A sacred kind of silence, like the sun setting without applause. The child was given a name, Ahmed. The one who is praised. Not because he survived fangs, but because he stood as living proof that the human heart can change. By late afternoon, the wind was still. White clouds stretched across the mountain tops like silk scarves draped on the shoulders of the sky. Along the dirt path climbing the hill, a small figure appeared once more, just like all those times before. But this time, no one called her witch, heretic, or madwoman. They called her by only one name, Ruqayyah. And that was enough. That name alone now reached the hearts of the entire village. The old hut no longer looked the same. Villagers had repaired the roof with fresh leaves, built a small fence. But Ruqayyah simply smiled, stepped inside, and quietly gathered the bowls, the mats, and the faded ash from the hearth. She would not stay. When Ahmed the child, once carried off by a leopard, turned 3 months old, he was brought back to the mountain and placed in her lap. As a gesture of gratitude, she brushed his cheek soft as wind, then looked at the young mother. Teach him to love, before you teach him to obey. The mother nodded, tears falling freely. Where will you go? She asked. Wherever someone cast out is still needed. She smiled, squinting toward the misty mountains. The next morning, the entire village walked her down the mountain. No one planned it, yet everyone brought something. A stick of incense, a flask of water, a small ball of rice. As if to offer something back. To her. To the leopard. To the past. And to themselves. The priest handed her a small cloth pouch. I no longer worship stone, he said. But I kept this little hammer. To remember the time I wanted to break a person. Instead of breaking the stubbornness inside me. She did not refuse. Only nodded. Baby Ahmed, now able to sit, reached his arms out to her. She bent down, kissed his forehead, and turned away. The leopard was already waiting at the forest's edge. It needed no leash, no command, only to follow its heart. Ruqayyah placed her hand on its head one last time. If the day ever comes when I can no longer walk, then you will lead the way. It didn't roar. It simply bowed its head and walked into the trees. She followed. And when the village returned home, they found no footprints. Only a faint glimmer of light, where sunlight pierced the canopy. The final trace of a soul who had come to awaken the hearts of men. Thank you for staying with us until the final moment of Ruqayyah's journey. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to leave a comment below. Sparkles, share your thoughts, or a lesson you've taken from Ruqayyah's path. Folded hands, we deeply value your reflections. Each one gives us strength to continue bringing meaningful, human-centered stories into the world. Pushpin, if this video moved you, please like, subscribe, and share to help spread these gentle lights across the world. We're grateful for you. And we look forward to seeing you in the next story.